Mr. Kinnock, you spoke last month of the need to re-examine truths once held to be self-evident. How far is your own approach to socialism now based on an acceptance that socialism as it was defined by Labour itself has lost any wide or broad appeal it may have had for the electorate?
I don't think socialism was ever properly defined by Labour. There have been people within the Labour movement over many decades who have provided definitions. My favourite collection comes from Aneurin Bevan, R.H. Tawney, G.D.H. Cole, Blatchford, Keir Hardy, Crossland. There's an assortment of people, but one of the simultaneous weaknesses and strengths of the Labour Party is that for the sake of breadth, it never established an ideology. And whilst that was an advantage in a width of appeal, it was a disadvantage in that it didn't sufficiently specify what the party stood for, and we're still trying to resolve that dilemma.
But what is the central issue for you in redefining the future path of socialism?
Certainly, I was about to come on to that. Consequently, therefore, we have to make it absolutely clear that the Labour Party and everything it stands for is consistent with the objectives and values as they're perceived by the British people, and that we had little difficulty doing, except for a gap in relatively recent years when it appeared that we'd stepped outside these lines of comprehension. To some extent, it's restoring that comprehension that we are the party of collective provision for individual emancipation, that we believe in the maximum return from the resources of the country, and that therefore requires a substantial degree of planning, and that the objective of all of our undertakings is economic prosperity and justice in distribution. Now, if we establish those factors clearly in the assortment of ways, I think that we are succeeding in re-establishing the respect of the British people for the Labour Party.
But to win next time, you need a triumph of something like 1945 proportions, much more than Mr. Wilson's reconstruction of the Labour Party's image in 1964. You inherit a history where you've had the worst result since 1918. From Norwich to Penzance, there's an electoral desert for you. Only 11% of people voted Labour outside the London constituencies. And you emerge with a majority of votes among only three groups of people in this country: blacks, Glaswegians, and you'll be relieved to hear, and people yes. in Mid Glamorgan. Yes. Now, how can you turn that round? You say that you've stepped outside the bounds of comprehension, but the people have rejected what you've stood for.
What you've just been saying is all our yesterdays, and they won't return because in the 2.5 years since that disaster occurred, as the reward for 3 or 4 years in which we didn't take ourselves seriously, and therefore you couldn't expect the British people to take us very seriously, there's been an immense change in the Labour Party, partly because of my insistence upon different directions, but also because the party has responded with readiness to a new assertion of what we stand for and the directions in which we should be going. So that consequently we are not now talking about an electoral desert in any part of the country, as county council election results, European election results, opinion polls very clearly demonstrate. We're not talking about only attracting the support of a small proportion of the population. We're talking about a lead in any measurement that we want to use amongst women, amongst the C2 socioeconomic groups, a huge lead among the young, and a real turnaround there. And the third thing is, yes, we will require a monumental achievement to win majority power at the next election, and we do that because the factor that just about everyone is leaving out is that we fought the election last time, for the first time in many decades, as one of three parties. We shall do so as one of 2.5 parties at least next time. And whereas the existence of that third force in politics worked to our disadvantages by splitting the anti-conservative vote last time, the possibility is that the Conservatives have got rather more to worry about on the next occasion. So in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons, our electoral prospects in this 2.5 years have been transformed mainly as a consequence of our own efforts, and there's still more efforts to come in order to put us even further ahead in every one of these groups right across the country, because we're a national party.
Surprised you quote the opinion polls in support of what you say. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher has gone ahead in the opinion polls, despite the unemployment and all the other conditions of the country to which you draw attention.
There have been a couple of occasions in which Mrs. Thatcher has registered something like a 2-point lead. Very, very rare occasions. And when you consider where Mrs. Thatcher started from in 1983, then it's extraordinary how we have not only drawn level, but gone ahead, not only in the overall polls, but in important geographical areas and amongst very substantial groups, like the C2s, a third of the electorate. We now have a substantial lead. Like the Young, who will constitute about 3.5 million votes at the next general election. We've got a huge lead. So it isn't simply a question of opinion polls, it's responses, attitudes, opportunities which we're exploiting in full.
In your Fabian lecture last month, you said that Britain remains a capitalist country whose injustices still cause moral revolt.
Yes.
To be the main chord in the tone of British socialism. And you said it was the prime responsibility of socialists to improve it, employing at all times, you said, this advice, to combine pessimism of the intellect with optimism of the will. Now, what dilemma does that express for you?
It doesn't express a real dilemma. It is a requirement for discipline. The quotation, actually, is from Antonio Gramsci, another favorite of mine. And what it means is, to translate it, if you like, is to put it into Bevan's phrase, hot ideas and cool heads and tongues, so that we recognize the realities of the challenge before us, and not daunted by that, but persist with our policies for confronting those realities with a realistic attitude, practical policies, but nevertheless with a vision and a purpose that arises from moral revolt and has very strong ethical purpose. And that's the best combination of what could be called Labour's democratic socialist values.
Now, why does the leader of the Labour Party draw encouragement from the writings of an Italian communist like Gramsci, whose writings were canvassed in the ideological debate in the 1950s and 1960s?
Because he was right. He was right in at least the degree to which I quoted him. Another thing he said, that he hated throwing stones in the dark. And I think that that also expresses my temperament and the temperament of the Labour Party. We don't pursue objectives simply because they are adornments, but because they're practical objectives and they will result in the change in the condition of people. And so where Gramsci was right, I quote him. Where I disagree with him, I naturally don't. Nationalization, you say it's unsaleable. I recall many occasions on which major companies were threatened with closure various times in the last 20 years. And the first thing that the working people whose jobs are jeopardized demonstrate for, the moment that the real jeopardy gathers like a cloud over that company, is public ownership. Now, I think that nationalism has got a bad name.
Nationalization.
Nationalization. Sorry, nationalism has got a bad name in any case. But nationalization's got a bad name. Partly because of its design, partly because it was never communicated as being of public advantage. Few people were reminded of the basic functional reasons for nationalization in the first place. And thirdly, we never made up our minds whether the nationalized industry was to be run as a commercial enterprise in the public interest, or whether it was to be a source of subsidy in the public interest. And that has meant that for workers and for managers in the public enterprises, that they've constantly been used as brakes and accelerators for wider government policies. I think that's always been unfair to them. It's something I've always preached against, and that consideration must be a basis for policy in the future. The question that arises now, of course, is why is the government and how is the government undertaking denationalization, and who is benefiting from that process of selling off great public assets? It certainly isn't the workers, who have a tiny proportion of the shares, less than 2%. It's not the general public that is, generally speaking, lost income earners for the general public. And it certainly isn't the advancement of technology or British manufacturing, because if, like British Telecom, everybody's starting to buy stuff abroad, then that's further diminished our trading stock in the world. So the only people that can be benefiting are very substantial institutions and rich individuals who are making a very fat killing of the act of denationalization, which is being taken for ideological reasons and not for reasons of any benefit to the public. Now, we therefore make the argument of common ownership for public advantage that is as a multitude of measures for public advantage, and it's on that basis that we will, of course, be renationalising.
When I said nationalization was unsaleable, I didn't mean that it wasn't saleable to the people who work in the industries, as you pointed out. That's ambiguous, but it's not been saleable to the consumer. So if you're still committed to the process of renationalization, does that mean that were you to be the government, we shall have to go through the same sort of toing and froing that this country went through 20 years ago over steel, for example, where the Labour Party nationalized it in 53. It was then renationalized by Labour in 67. Do we have to go through all that again?
Why didn't you say that to the Conservatives, and why did nobody else say that to the Conservatives when they came forward with the great denationalization plans? Why is there not a single newspaper now currently complaining at the disruption of British Gas or British Telecom or any of the other denationalized companies? Why is nobody saying, but you mustn't do this because it'll disrupt?
They have a mandate to do it.
No, but those institutions, yes, we had a mandate to nationalize and also to maintain in public ownership these concerns. Now, did they say at any time, and I don't ask the question just rhetorically, did they say at any time the consequence of denationalization was to be big fat killings for some of the richest people and institutions in the country? Of course they didn't. It was sold on an entirely different basis. Now then, the other question is this. If it's disruption and toing and froing that worries people, then they should have been much more cautious about giving a mandate to the government that is causing the greatest act of disruption and in the process economic desolation. And so I'm not convinced by the arguments that talk about disruption. What concerns me is that the consequence of the acts of denationalization is to put this country at commercial disadvantage and to put the people at disadvantage in terms of public service as well as public earnings. And they're the sums that are going to have to be done in the course of re-establishing public obligation, public control, and public ownership.
But if you still see renationalization as the necessary condition of socialism...
I didn't say that. The national condition of the national interest. I think that it's in the national interest that these great strategic industries should be subject to democratic control and not liable to external whims that pay no heed to public obligation or public service or the part that they have to play in the remainder of the productive economy whatsoever.
How is your commitment to renationalization compatible with what you said in your much applauded speech at Bournemouth, where you spoke of a servant state under people's feet, not over their heads? Now,
absolutely compatible.
If I may just finish, it doesn't sound like seizing the commanding heights of the economy, as Nye Bevan said, nor the foothills.
No, it isn't in the least bit like that. Part of the enabling state, the servant state at the disposal of the people, is to have essential industries whose prosperity actually subscribes directly to the general well-being of the nation at the disposal of the nation, instead of at the disposal of a minute fraction of the people of the nation, many of whom have got no vested interest in the future good fortune of this country at all.
No, the real point, I thought, in what you said at Bournemouth was that the state had to be under people's feet,
that's right,
not over their heads.
Yes. Surely
the basic critique of Clause 4 was exactly that.
Precisely.
The state was becoming,
the best obtainable
was seen as becoming authoritarian and over people's heads.
Clause 4 was established in the shadow of the Russian Revolution and was deliberately phrased, and anybody who reads the history of the time will know, in order to ensure that this was never the party that preached or sought the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a euphemism for all kinds of filthy things, as we well know. And the phraseology of Clause 4 and the intentions behind it to secure the fruits of production by the best obtainable means of popular administration and control. That was a very deliberate choice that took common ownership right away from the idea of the Sovietized state and everything associated with it. Now, it is that form of common ownership for the workers by hand and by brain, and taken in conjunction with the next clause about the emancipation of the people, that actually seeks to put the state and all that therein is at the disposal of the people and not over the heads of the people. That's always been the case. Look, if I can just demonstrate it, if we collectively provide the opportunity for individuals through the means of maintained education, is the state then over the head of the people or at the disposal of the people? Plainly, it is at the disposal of the people. It's not predominating, it's not dominating, it's not superimposing itself. And I'm not using that as analogy, I'm using that as illustration of how collective provision, preferably organized by democratic means, one of which is the democratically elected government of the state, can actually make available opportunities, chances that simply would not be available if people were left to their own resource.
But it can't be done, can it, without high taxation? And there's been the thing that has changed
Mrs. Thatcher's put taxation up a great deal.
But you're going to put it up more.
No, we're not. Who said that?
Well, how can you put it up if you're going to renationalize everything?
Well, I tell you in a couple of ways. I'm not saying for 1 second that there would never be an adjustment in some areas of taxation. I'm not going to suggest that for 1 second. I'm talking about the tax burden on the country. It is 15% higher under Mrs. Thatcher than it was under the last Labour government, and she was the woman who got elected in the first place, on the undertaking that taxes must and taxes will be cut.